The ledger was open on the table when Vera arrived at Lord Osic's study, which told her the conversation had already been decided before she walked through the door. She'd learned to read the room through its objects. A decanter on the corner of the desk meant he wanted something delivered with ease, softened before it landed. A fire built higher than the season required meant he was cold with something that had nothing to do with temperature. The ledger, open to the tribute page, bound in brown calfskin that Vera herself had stitched 3 years ago, meant he wanted her complicity dressed up as administrative work. She crossed the room and stood in front of his desk without waiting to be told. "The quarter accounts need adjustment," Osic said without looking up. His voice had the same texture it always did, smooth and even. The voice of a man who'd spent decades making unreasonable things sound like routine. The Crown's assessment came back higher than projected. The figures on page 11 need to reflect the revised estimate. Vera looked at page 11. She had written those figures herself. She knew what they reflected because she'd spent 6 weeks cross-referencing every entry against the pack's actual grain stores, livestock records, and border trade documentation. The numbers were accurate. That, she understood, was the problem. "The figures on page 11 are correct," she said. Osic looked up. His cold blue eyes could go very still when he was deciding something, and they went still now. "The figures on page 11 are inconvenient. They're consistent with the last 2 quarters. Changing them now creates a discrepancy the Crown auditors would flag immediately. Crown auditors review hundreds of accounts. They notice what they're directed to notice." He leaned back in his chair and studied her the way he studied documents he intended to file away for future use. 2 entries. Less than an hour. "I won't falsify tribute records." The silence that followed had weight to it. Not the hot weight of anger. Osic rarely got hot with anger. He got cold with it. And the cold was more precise, more deliberate. He held her gaze for a long moment and then said, "You may go," with the same tone he might use to dismiss a completed task. She went. She walked back through the corridor with her hands steady and her breathing controlled. And she did not let herself think about what his silence meant until she was inside the archive with the door shut behind her. She stood in the narrow aisle between the shelves where the smell of old parchment and binding glue had been the closest thing to safe she'd known for 14 years. Her parents had died when she was 9. A border collapse. 2 neighboring packs had gone to war over a contested ridge, and the village her family occupied had been caught between them. Osic had taken her in from the wreckage. At 9 years old, with nowhere else to go, she had been grateful with the uncomplicated gratitude of a child who didn't yet understand the architecture of what she'd been placed inside. She'd discovered her lack of pack registration at 17, when she tried to file an appeal against a housing dispute and was told she had no legal standing. Osic had been unsurprised when she brought it to him. "You're under my direct protection," he'd said. "The formal registration isn't necessary." She understood then, with the particular clarity of someone who processed ledgers for a living, that protection and registration were not equivalents. The protection was his to extend or withdraw. The absence of registration was the mechanism that made that true. She began packing that evening. Not because she believed she could leave. She had no independent income, no external contacts Osic hadn't managed, no route out of the territory that didn't pass through his gates. She packed because she needed her things in order. The archive held the better part of 14 years of her work. She couldn't take most of it. What she could take were her 12 personal reference volumes, books she'd assembled herself over the years, each one a compilation of correspondence and filed records organized the way her mind worked, by connection rather than by date. She went through them one by one. The 7th book gave her pause. She'd built it 3 years ago from a large batch of territorial correspondence she'd been given to sort and bind for permanent storage. 300 letters and associated pages, most of them routine, working through the stack over the course of a week. Buried in the middle, she'd found a set of pages in Osic's handwriting that she'd taken at the time for working drafts, messy-looking things, full of columns and figures, and had bound them with the rest without reading carefully. She read them carefully now. They weren't drafts. They were clean, deliberate records. 2 years of fund transfers from the PAC's accounts to 3 lords in the Eastern Territories. Lords Harwick, Drain, and Voss of the Crest Territories, bordering the contested region along the Empire's eastern edge. The amounts were specific. The intervals were consistent, and they aligned with a precision that made something in her chest go taut. With the periods she'd spent reconciling the pack accounts and finding certain line items inexplicably short. She stood in the archive for a long time after she understood what she was holding. The tribute discrepancy Ossick wanted falsified wasn't a separate problem. It was the visible surface of this one. The funds hadn't been diverted for personal use. The scale and distribution were wrong for that. He'd been moving money east, consistently and over years, to lords in a geographic cluster that shared a contested border. Anyone funding all three of them simultaneously was funding a coalition. What kind of coalition, and toward what end, she couldn't determine from these records alone. But the records were damning without that context. She placed the 7th book at the bottom of her travel bag and continued packing. 2 mornings later, she was standing in a line of 10 women outside the inner gates at dawn, dressed in the plainest gown she owned. Deep brown wool, long sleeves, nothing decorative, with her travel bag over one shoulder and the book sealed inside it. Ossick had informed her of her inclusion in the selection that same morning, with the same tone he used to assign quarterly tasks. She was in the registry. She would attend. The conversation was not an invitation for response. She'd understood, walking back to her room from that meeting, exactly what the calculation was. She would be dispensed quickly, an unregistered Omega with no title and no presentation value, and sent home with the others. His men would go through her belongings during the journey, or on arrival, and locate whatever she'd taken from the archive. He didn't know specifically what he was looking for, but he knew she'd taken something. She had seen it in his eyes 2 days ago, when the silence stretched too long after her refusal. The woman who came to stand beside her as the group assembled was a year or 2 younger than Vera's 23, with warm brown eyes and an openness about her face that was difficult to distrust on instinct. Her name was Marit Holland, and she'd come from a neighboring territory under obligations she didn't elaborate on. "You look like you've already decided this is a formality," Marit said. "Most selections end without a bond recognition. Statistically, we attend, stand in a line, and go home." Marit was quiet for a moment. "Do you believe in the bond?" Vera considered it honestly. She was Omega. She had the heightened awareness, the pack sense, the low-frequency recognition of other shifters that came with the designation. She'd felt the periphery of that sense before, the pull of hierarchy, the specific weight of an alpha's presence in a room. But what the accounts described was something else entirely. Larger. More specific. "I believe in it the way I believe in storms," she said. "It's real. I've just never been in the right place when one arrived." Marit smiled, quick and genuine. "I think I like you." The journey to the Alpha King's fortress took 2 days by road. Vera spent most of it with her bag in her lap, and her gaze on the terrain passing outside the window, turning the contents of the 7th book over in her mind, with the methodical attention she gave to any problem worth solving. The transfers were documented. The recipients were named. The timeline was reconstructible. What she didn't have was the full shape of the why, and she suspected the why was sitting somewhere in the administrative records of the Alpha King's court, which had been conducting territorial audits of the Eastern accounts for the better part of a year, if the Crown correspondence she'd processed last autumn was any indication. She might be carrying the piece that made their incomplete picture whole. She didn't know that yet with certainty. The suspicion was enough to keep her thinking through every mile of road. The fortress appeared on the 2nd afternoon, rising from a hillside with the settled authority of a structure built to outlast whoever happened to occupy it. Stone walls, square towers, banners in deep charcoal, and dark green snapping in the late afternoon wind. The Alpha King's colors. She'd read them in documents her entire professional life, and understood them as symbols. Against actual stone and actual sky at actual scale, they communicated something documents couldn't. The 10 women were received at the inner gate and shown to shared quarters. Marit claimed the bed nearest Vera's without asking. Vera unpacked only what the morning required, wedged the travel bag between the wall and the headboard, and lay down without undressing. She lay awake long after Marit's breathing had steadied. The fortress settled around her in the dark, stone shifting in the night air, and she listened to it and thought about the 7th book and the documents inside it. Somewhere in this building's administrative wing, The Alpha King's auditors were working through Eastern accounts that told an incomplete story. She was carrying the part they were missing, and the man who'd sent her here was counting on her not knowing that until it was too late to matter. She knew it. That was the variable Ossik hadn't accounted for. Tomorrow she would stand in a line and be dismissed and sent home. And somewhere between here and Ossik's territory, his men would find the book, and the document would disappear. And that would be the end of it. That was his calculation. She was not yet sure what hers was. But she had all night to work on it, and she had never needed more than that. The ceremony hall was larger than any room Vera had worked in, which was saying something. She'd spent 14 years in the administrative wing of a territorial lord's estate, and the rooms there ran to the practical rather than the impressive. This was something else. Vaulted stone overhead painted with hunting scenes and the charcoal and green motifs of the dressed line. Long windows set deep into the walls. The kind of space designed to remind everyone inside it of the precise proportion of their importance to the larger order of things. She stood at the end of the line and noted the exit. It wasn't a dramatic discovery. She'd simply spent the walk from the quarters to the hall, filing away the architecture of every corridor they passed through. The way she filed anything that might become useful. The servants' passage running along the east wall, its access door disguised as a wall panel, where the decorative carving broke its own symmetry slightly. She'd noticed the break in the pattern the way she noticed errors in ledgers, automatically, without deciding to. The 10 women had been arranged by a ceremony attendant in a sequence that Vera suspected correlated to territory and title, which placed her last. She used the time this created. The Alpha King descended from the dais with no introduction. She had expected something more formal, a herald, an announcement, some procedural structure that would signal the gravity of what the ceremony was supposed to represent. Instead, there was a man in a dark coat, walking down a line of women with the quiet attention of someone doing necessary work carefully. He was younger than she'd anticipated, though she hadn't spent much energy anticipating. Dark hair, close cut at the sides, a beard kept well, broad through the shoulders, in a way that read as functional rather than ceremonial. His eyes were amber dark, and they moved with precision, not unkind, but not soft. The kind of eyes that measured things. He spoke briefly to each woman. Some exchanges lasted longer than others. Most did not. Women were directed to one side of the hall with clear dismissal, and then toward the inner galleries where candidates waited a night for escort assignments and departure papers before leaving the fortress. Vera watched his progress and calculated. She wasn't calculating his eyes or his manner or the particular quality of his presence, though she registered all of those things in the same peripheral way she registered the architecture. She was calculating time. He was moving at an interval of roughly 3 to 4 minutes per woman. She was 10th. She had 25 minutes, possibly 30. At the 15-minute mark, when his attention was on the 5th woman, and the attendants were occupied with the directed candidates, Vera stepped back twice, reached the east wall, pressed her hand to the carved panel where the symmetry broke, and pushed. The passage was narrow and dark, and smelled of candle tallow and old stone. She moved through it without hesitating. She'd had all night to decide, and she'd made her decision somewhere around the 3rd hour of darkness, lying in a bed that wasn't hers, while a fortress she didn't know settled around her. The calculation was clear. The document in the 7th book was evidence, but evidence required a recipient, and she had no way to deliver it safely from inside the ceremony hall, not with Ossik's men stationed at the outer gates. She needed the stables first. She needed her horse and a plan that extended past the next 2 hours. The passage led out through a side door into the kitchen yard, which fed into the inner courtyard, which opened into the stable row along the fortress's eastern wall. She crossed the kitchen yard with her bag over her shoulder, and her pace steady. The stable block was warm, and smelled of hay and horses and the particular animal calm that she'd always found easier to be inside than any room full of people. 6 of the 10 stalls were occupied. A stable hand at the far end looked up when she entered, and then returned to his work. She found a groom near the tack room, and was in the middle of negotiating the hire of a horse and a road guide to the eastern pass, when she heard footsteps behind her, and felt it. She'd felt the peripheral pull of a strong alpha's presence in a room before. That low register of pack hierarchy that lived below conscious thought. This was different in degree. It was directional. It came from behind her, and moved down her spine like the resonance of a bell, struck at a frequency her body knew before her mind caught up. She turned. The Alpha King stood at the entrance to the stable block, with his coat open and his sleeves still pushed to the forearms. He had not brought guards. The first thing she registered was that he had found her, in a fortress of several hundred rooms and a yard she'd crossed without announcement, in under 15 minutes. He looked at her for a moment without speaking. "You left," he said. "I was going to be sent home regardless. I shortened the process. That's a reasonable argument." He came further into the stable block and stopped at a distance that was neither close nor far, and his amber dark eyes moved from her face to the travel bag on her shoulder and back. "What's in the bag?" "My things." Also reasonable. He studied her with the same precision she'd watched him use in the ceremony hall. "Your name is Vera Ashwin. You were added to the registry 3 days ago." "Lord Ossick's registry?" "Yes. Against your consent." It wasn't a question. "How did you know that?" she asked. "Because he amended a formally closed registry. That requires approval from my office." He held her gaze. "I approved it because an amendment from that specific territory, at this specific time, was worth understanding. My auditors have been reviewing Ossick's tribute accounts for 18 months. Your name is the certifying signature on the last 6 submissions." She was quiet. "You're not accusing me," she said. "I'm informing you that you're inside a Crown investigation whether you leave this fortress or not. My auditors have identified discrepancies they can't fully account for with the documentation available to them. They know something is missing. They know its shape." He paused. "If you ride east today, you ride into a situation where the incomplete picture works against you, not for you." She did not look at her bag. He wasn't pressing. That was the thing she kept returning to. The absence of pressure, the patience that wasn't performed. He was simply standing in a stable block, telling her facts and waiting to see what she did with them. "I'm not riding east for Ossick," she said. "I know. How? Because you use the servants' passage, not the main gate. Anyone reporting to Ossick would have used the main gate. He has 2 men stationed there." Something moved at the corner of his mouth. "You went the way that kept you out of their sight line." She exhaled slowly. The shape of the problem she'd been turning over since the previous night rearranged itself. "I'll stay," she said. "On one condition." He waited. "Nothing is filed under my name with your administration until I've decided what I'm giving you and how." She held his gaze. "I've spent 14 years in a territory where documentation was used as a mechanism of control. I won't sign anything in this building until I understand precisely what I'm signing." A pause. "No formal documentation. No filing. You stay here under my personal word until you choose otherwise." He didn't soften it or expand it. "If you need to leave at any point, you leave with an escort and safe passage beyond Ossick's reach. That isn't open to negotiation." She studied him. He let her do it without filling the silence. "Agreed," she said. They walked back across the kitchen yard and through the inner courtyard toward the ceremony hall. She matched his pace without adjusting for it. The ceremony hall's side entrance opened onto the main floor. They walked through it together. She felt the moment Ossick saw them. She gave no sign of it. She'd learned years ago that a controlled gaze was one of the few forms of leverage available to people in constrained positions. And she walked 3 more paces before letting her eyes move across the hall, the way they might move across any unfamiliar room. Noting, cataloging, landing on him without landing on him. He was standing near the dais. His cold blue eyes moved from Vera to Kaylin and back, and she watched the sequence she'd seen dozens of times before in smaller rooms. The smooth expression holding, the posture unchanged, and underneath both of those things, the fraction of a second where a man processed an outcome that didn't match his model and found no immediate correction. He hadn't expected her to come back at all. He certainly hadn't calculated her returning beside the Alpha King, unguarded, walking at an equal pace. Torin appeared at Kaylin's side, exchanged a few quiet words, and moved toward the dais. "The archive," Kaylin said, low enough for only her. "East corridor, 3rd floor. If that's where you want to work, it's available." She glanced at him. "You're assuming I have something to work with." "I'm assuming," he said, "that you didn't spend the night calculating how to leave this fortress, only to change your mind without reason? She didn't answer that. By the time she reached the third-floor corridor later that day, the archive master had already received Kaylin's order. Her access was granted by Crown authority, and it required no entry in any registry to exist. She had a great deal of work ahead of her. But she had the archive, and she had time, and for the first time since she'd understood what she was holding, neither of those things belonged to Ossik. The archive occupied 3 connected rooms on the east corridor's 3rd floor, reached by a staircase that turned twice before arriving at a door so plain it looked like a wall that hadn't fully committed to its function. Vera had found it on her first morning in the fortress simply by following the smell, old paper, binding glue, the specific dry quality of air that spent its life indoors among documents. The archive master, a compact man named Aldrich with ink-stained fingers and a manner that communicated he had formed opinions about everything and intended to share none of them, had shown her the organization system, established that she knew what she was doing, and left her to it with a completeness she found she respected. He'd done it without asking for her name in any registry. The order from the Crown had made the question irrelevant. For the first 3 days, she worked from memory. She'd spent 6 years as Ossik's primary archive keeper, before the last 4 had also made her his tribute accountant, and her memory for figures operated the way her memory for anything operated, not photographically, but architecturally. She remembered the structure of a record, its relationships, its position relative to everything around it. Given the shape of the problem, she could rebuild the framework without the originals in front of her. She started with the fiscal year ending 3 years ago, which was the earliest date represented in the transfers she'd found in the 7th book. Working backward through what she remembered of the pack accounts, she reconstructed the line items that had always been slightly short in the reconciliations, not short enough to flag for action, but short enough, consistently, that the pattern had registered without her yet understanding where it led. Those amounts had moved east. She mapped them on plain parchment, column by column, and let the picture assemble itself across the table. By the 4th day, she had a framework that could stand against documentation. What she needed next was the corroborating record from the Crown's side, what the Crest Lords had received, and when and how those amounts had moved through their own accounts. Kaylin's auditors had been building that half of the picture for 18 months. The 2 pieces needed to be set next to each other. She was checking her intervals against the 7th book's dates for the 3rd time on the 4th evening, when the archive door opened. She didn't startle. She'd heard the footsteps on the stairs, that directional awareness that preceded his presence by a reliable distance. Something she had stopped analyzing and simply noted. Kaylin came in and looked at the parchment covering the table without commenting on it. He'd exchanged the formal coat he wore in the public parts of the fortress for a plainer one, sleeves pushed to the forearms the same way they'd been in the stable block. He moved to the far end of the table and set down the folder he'd carried upstairs, and opened it without asking permission to share the space. She found she didn't mind. They worked in parallel for the better part of an hour. His presence didn't disrupt the quality of the silence so much as change its texture. It was fuller, more settled. The way a room felt different when the fire was properly tended rather than smoldering without attention. The auditors found a gap in Harwick's incoming records, he said eventually. 14 months. Nothing declared from pack-to-pack transfers. Harwick filed it as a data loss in a border dispute. It wasn't a data loss, Vera said. No. He turned a page. They've been trying to establish whether the origin was internal or external. An external origin changes the classification entirely. She looked at the parchment in front of her. External. Consistent origin. Consistent intervals. This wasn't opportunistic. Someone was funding something specific over time. He was quiet for a moment. I know. He closed the folder and looked at her across the table. You've been rebuilding the source records from memory. I kept the accounts for 6 years. The structure holds. How reliable is it? Reliable enough to tell you where to look in your own records to confirm it. She met his gaze. But I haven't shown you the 7th book yet. She saw the attention sharpen behind his eyes. When you're ready, he said. That was all. He returned to his folder and she returned to her columns, and the archive settled into its particular evening quiet. He came back the following evening, and the one after that, Marit found her on the morning of the 6th day, earlier than their usual hour, and her expression arrived ahead of the words in it. "Last night," Marit said, once they'd moved to the window seat at the far end of the corridor, where sound carried poorly. "Two of the other women, Lena, from the Ashford territory, and Senna Holton." Her voice was careful and measured, in the manner of someone who had spent hours deciding how to deliver a thing. They were approached separately. Different men, but wearing Ossex colors under plain traveling cloaks. Asking about your bag specifically, what you'd been carrying when you arrived, whether you'd left anything behind in the shared quarters. Vera absorbed this without reacting. They weren't threatened directly, Marit continued. But the manner of it was not comfortable. Lena left with her escort this morning. Senna is still in the East Wing. She was shaken. "Where in the East Wing?" Vera asked. "The second-floor common room, I think." Vera stood. "Come with me." She brought Marit to Kaelin directly. She found him in the administrative wing in the middle of a working session with Torin and one of his senior officers. She waited precisely long enough for the conversation to reach a natural pause before she walked in and stated the situation, clearly, without additional framing. Two women approached by men wearing Ossex colors. Questions about her bag. One had already departed. She watched Torin's jaw tighten. Kaelin's face didn't change, but something in it did. A settling, a downward weight. The expression of a man converting a suspicion into a confirmed fact and measuring what it meant. "All 9, he said to Torin. "Within 2 days. Confirm consent from each one before any escort moves." Torin was out of the room in under a minute. Kaelin looked at Vera. "Lena, the woman who left this morning." "Which route?" Marit provided the direction. Kaelin sent a second rider within 10 minutes, with instructions for the escort to return Lena to the fortress on the condition of her agreement, with full explanation given before she was asked to decide. "She chooses," he said to Vera, after the rider had gone. "But she doesn't travel unsupported through territory where Ossex men are running inquiry routes." She watched him work through 3 separate instructions in under a quarter hour, each one direct, each one complete. That evening, she brought the 7th book to the archive. She set it on the table in front of him and opened it to the bound pages in the center without preamble. He read slowly. She watched his hands on the pages. Still, the careful stillness of a man being deliberate about how he received something significant. When he reached the final column, he turned back to the beginning and went through the figures again. 2 years and 4 months, he said. Consistent with the gap in Harwick's incoming records. She set her parchment framework beside the open book. Your auditors had the receiving end. This is the disbursement record from the origin, in Ossic's hand. He was quiet. He asked you to falsify the tribute accounts, he said. 3 days before the selection. The amounts he wanted adjusted matched the shortfall from the most recent disbursement period. She paused. It wasn't personal embezzlement. The distribution is wrong for that. He was moving funds to fund a coordinated alignment across a specific border segment. Harwick, Drain, and Voss. He looked at the map pinned to the wall above the table, at the Eastern Territories and the pass they collectively controlled. Funding all 3 simultaneously doesn't consolidate his own position. It builds theirs. Someone who wants the eastern border to shift needs all 3 in agreement. Ossic doesn't have the resources to move a border on his own, but if he's acting as an intermediary, then what I have is the mechanism, Kaelin said, without yet having what's behind it. What you have is enough to hold him on what's documented here, she said, while you build the rest. He set his hands flat on the table. He looked at the 2 records laid side by side, and then he looked at her. And the quality of what was in his expression was different from the attention she'd been on the receiving end of in any room before this one. She became aware, without intending to, that her hands were completely still. They were always slightly unsteady when she worked at high stakes, a fine tremor she'd learned to account for, pressing her wrist to the table to anchor her writing. She had been working at high stakes for 6 days in a row, and her hands were flat on the table and entirely motionless. She looked at them. Then she looked back at him. He was watching her with the measured quality of a man who had noticed it and understood what it meant, and was choosing not to name it before she was ready for it to be named. She was not ready, but she was aware of it, with the full honesty she'd given everything else in this room. that something between them had passed the point of being purely professional, and that they had both known it for longer than either of them had acknowledged. "I'll draft the summary notation tonight," she said. "Everything the council will need to open a formal proceeding. I'll have Torin prepare the notification in the morning." She pulled the parchment toward her and reached for a pen. The archive around them settled into its late-night quiet, and outside the windows the dark had long since arrived, and the torchlight moved in slow patterns on the old stone walls while she wrote, and he read. And the 7th book lay open on the table between them like something that had finally reached the place it was always meant to go. The formal convocation had gone out the morning after Vera finished the summary notation, and Ossic had sent his acknowledgement within 2 days, which told her something she filed carefully. A lord with nothing to hide took time with correspondence. A lord calculating how much the other side already knew, responded quickly enough to suggest he was working from incomplete information, and preferred to manage the gap before it widened further. She was in the archive when Torin came to tell her the date had been set. He stood in the doorway the way he stood everywhere, compact, contained, with the economy of a man who said precisely what was needed and trusted the other person to manage the rest. 4 days, he said. He'll arrive mid-morning on the 14th. She looked up from the table. And the other women? Lena and Senna? Both here, both willing to speak. He paused. Senna asked about the process yesterday. What to expect. I'll speak with her. She found Senna in the East Wing common room that afternoon, a composed woman of about 30 with dark circles under her eyes that had been there since the night she'd been approached. They sat across from each other in the window light, and Vera told her what the council session would look like, what she would be asked to confirm, and what she would not be required to speak to if she chose to limit her account. She didn't soften the fact that Ossic would be in the room. Experience had taught her that people manage difficult situations better when they'd had time to picture them in advance. Senna listened without interruption. He sent 2 men, she said. I couldn't identify their faces, but I know Ossic's colors as well as I know my own name. They weren't subtle. I think the lack of subtlety was deliberate. It was. It was designed to create a specific kind of uncertainty, a reminder that Ossic's reach extended past the fortress walls, that cooperation with the Crown investigation carried a cost attached to it whether you chose to pay it or not. Your account corroborates a pattern of conduct that goes beyond the financial records. The council needs to see the full scope of what he's been doing. Senna held her gaze. Then I'll tell them everything. The 14th arrived cold and clear. Vera dressed in the darkest gown she owned and went to the archive before the session to review her documentation in sequence 1 final time. Though she didn't need to. The sequence lived in her the way all things she'd worked through thoroughly eventually did. The council chamber occupied the 2nd floor of the administrative wing, a long rectangular room with a heavy oak table and high windows that let in gray morning light without doing much to warm the stone. 7 council members sat along one side of the table. Torin stood near the far wall. Kaelin was at the head. Ossic came in with 2 advisors in the manner of a man arriving at a difficulty he expected to navigate. He greeted the council with measured courtesy, took his seat across from the documentation laid out on the table, and began with the ease of someone who had spent 4 days constructing a version of events designed to hold. I appreciate the council's time, he said. I understand there are questions about my account records, which I'm entirely prepared to address. I'd also ask that we speak directly to the matter of my ward, whose presence here appears to be the result of a misunderstanding I'd like to resolve. He hadn't looked at Vera once, not when he entered, not while he spoke. She sat at the end of the table with her hands flat on its surface and gave him nothing to read. The first portion of the session proceeded as she'd anticipated. Ossic walked through a prepared account of the tribute discrepancies, attributing every gap to administrative delays, border disruptions, and a clerical rotation that had created inconsistencies in record-keeping. He was fluent and specific, and entirely plausible to anyone who hadn't spent 6 years managing those same records. Kaelin let him finish without interruption. The documentation before the council covers disbursement records across a 28-month period, he said. It identifies consistent fund transfers to 3 Crest Lord territories. Not administrative delays, transfers. Scheduled, specific in amount. continuing beyond any border disruption that affected those periods. He held Osik's gaze with the kind of stillness that didn't require heat behind it. "These are your records." Osik looked at the document for the first time. She watched the interval, the flicker of recognition before his expression composed itself into measured skepticism. He knew this format. He knew this hand. "I'd need time to review anything claimed to originate from my administration," he said. "The provenance of these documents." "The provenance is Vera Ashwin," Kaylin said, "who archived the records herself and identified the transfers when reviewing her own working materials." Osik turned to her then. It was the first direct address since he'd entered, and the shift was deliberate. He adjusted his posture, his tone, his entire register, moving from counsel argument into something that performed concern. "Vera," he said, warm and measured, "I understand that your time here may have created confusion about where certain obligations lie. You've been in the company of people who have every reason to interpret these records in a particular. The figures in those records correspond to the line items I reconciled in your tribute accounts across 6 consecutive fiscal years," she said. "The amounts match to within a margin consistent with standard pack-to-pack transfer costs. I can account for every column in this chamber without reference to the documents currently in front of you." She did. Methodically and without pace changes, she walked the council through the reconstructed framework, period by period, amount by amount, and set it beside the originals until the 2 images resolved into one consistent picture. Osik let her finish. Then he addressed the full council rather than her. "The council should be aware," he said, with the precision of an argument prepared well in advance, "that the individual presenting this account has no formal legal standing within the PAC structure, and Omega, who has never completed PAC registration, has no capacity under territorial law to contribute sworn evidence to a Crown proceeding. This is not a question of character. It is a procedural fact." He looked at the record keeper at the far end of the table. "I would ask the council to confirm the registration status of Vera Ashwin before incorporating her account into the formal record." The response that moved through the council was not agreement, but it was genuine consideration, which was the exact result he needed. 2 members conferred. One referenced the relevant statute. Vera waited for the room to settle. "Under territorial law," she said, "every dependent arriving in a PAC's domain must be registered within 1 year of their arrival. I arrived in Lord Osik's territory 14 years ago at the age of 9. She looked at the council member who had the statute open. "If registration was never filed, the law identifies 2 possible explanations: negligence on the part of the dependent, or deliberate suppression by the lord of the territory. The registration records Osik submitted as part of his administrative audit don't include my name. Not in any year. Not a delayed filing. Not an incomplete entry." The record keeper confirmed it in under 3 minutes. "A lord who suppresses registration controls the dependent entirely," Vera continued. "No legal standing, no right of appeal, no capacity to leave the territory without permission, no ability to file evidence before this council. The same lord who built that mechanism across 14 years is now using its result to disqualify the only witness who can speak directly to what his records document." She paused. "That is not a procedural point. That is the mechanism itself, operating exactly as designed." Osik's composure held. "Lord Osik." Kaylin's voice didn't rise. "The council has the statute. The council has the filing history. The question of suppression is a factual determination." He held Osik's gaze with the settled weight of a man who had been patient for a very long time and had reached the far edge of it. "We'll continue." Lena was precise. She described the 2 men, the questions they'd asked, and the clasp pattern on their traveling cloaks, with a detail specific enough that a second council member identified it as a variant used by Osik's Eastern Household Guard. Senna was steadier in the chamber than she'd been in the common room, sitting upright and delivering her account, with the flat clarity of someone who had decided before she walked in that the room didn't get to see her afraid. She held to it through every question. When both women had finished, Osik made 2 more procedural objections, each one narrower than the last. Each one met with documentation he had evidently underestimated the council possessed. His final argument, that the financial transfers constituted voluntary aid to struggling territories during border instability, a lord's prerogative under the territorial compact, was answered with the compact's relevant section, which required prior disclosure to the Crown. He had filed none. Kaelin looked at him across the table with an expression that contained nothing theatrical. "Lord Ossick, you are held under Crown authority on the grounds of undisclosed financial coordination with territorial lords under active audit, deliberate suppression of a dependent's legal registration across 14 years, and directed interference with witnesses in a Crown proceeding." He set his hands flat on the table. "Your advisors may remain until the formal determination is issued." Ossick sat for a moment without moving. He looked at Vera, not with the warmth he'd performed at the opening, not with visible anger, with the expression of a man revising a calculation he had been entirely certain of, running it forward in every direction, and finding no version of it that resolved in his favor. The guards came in before he stood. The proceedings against the Three Crest Lords took 4 weeks and 3 days. Vera knew this precisely because she'd tracked every session in the margins of her working notes, not out of impatience, but out of the habit of documenting intervals that might matter later. Lords Harwick, Drain, and Voss were convoked separately, on the reasoning that a joint session would allow them to align their accounts before the council had examined each one independently. Kaelin had made that decision the morning after Ossick's detention, and she'd heard Torrin confirm it through the archive wall. The first exhibit filed in the formal record was not the 7th book, and not her reconstructed framework, and not the testimony of Lena or Senna. It was the tribute ledger from Ossick's study, the one open on the table the morning she'd refused to alter it. The council's documentation team had recovered it during the audit of Ossick's records, and Torrin had brought her the filing notice as a matter of courtesy. She held the paper for a long moment, and thought about standing in that study with her hands steady and her decision already made, and then she placed the notice in her working materials and returned to the Harwick accounts she'd been building. The 9 women had largely returned to their packs by the end of the first week, each with a Crown escort and a formal letter of acknowledgement addressed to their respective lords. Lena and Senna received separate letters recognizing their testimony by name. Senna came to the archive to show her. She stood in the doorway with the letter open and looked at Vera with an expression that was not precisely gratitude, but was its close neighbor. "I keep thinking about whether I would have told them," she said, "if you hadn't explained it to me first." "You would have. Maybe." She folded the letter carefully. "It helped to know the shape of the room before I was in it." Vera thought about that after Senna had gone. About the ways in which knowing the architecture of a thing in advance was the difference between moving through it and being moved by it. Marit stayed. Not indefinitely, and not without clear reasoning. She'd written to her own lord explaining the extended absence as material participation in a Crown proceeding, which was accurate, and received a reply that Vera gathered from her expression was grudging, but not obstructive. She occupied the room next to Vera's in the East Wing, shared meals when the schedule permitted, and appeared occasionally in the archive doorway with questions that were sometimes about the proceedings and sometimes entirely something else. "He looks for you," Marit said one evening, leaning in the doorway with a cup of something warm. Vera didn't look up from the Drain records. "He has questions about the accounts. He has Torrin for accounts." Marit's tone was placid. "He doesn't walk 2 flights of stairs to find Torrin." Vera set down her pen. "I'm aware of what it is. Are you managing it, or are you avoiding naming it so you don't have to decide what to do with it?" She looked at Marit for a long moment. "Both," she said, simultaneously. Marit smiled and went away, and Vera picked up her pen and sat with that honesty in the archive silence. The bond had been present since the stables. She'd recognized it by its effects rather than any single sensation. The directional awareness that arrived before he did. The particular quality of quiet that settled when he was in a room. The fact that her hands, which had carried a low tremor through every high-pressure task for as long as she could remember, had been entirely still since the night she'd brought the 7th book to the table. What she had been less certain of was what to do with that understanding. The Harwick proceeding concluded on a Wednesday. Drain capitulated the following Monday after his account contradicted Harwick's on 2 specific points that Vera flagged in the morning session and the council addressed by afternoon. Voss held longest, but the documentation was too layered by that stage. He had the least leverage and the most complete evidentiary record working against him, and on the final day of the 4th week, He withdrew his formal objection and filed a cooperative account. The night after Voss filed, Kaylin came to the archive at the hour she'd come to expect and didn't open a folder. He sat across from her at the table and was quiet for a while. Voss's assets are being assessed, he said. Harwick and Drain faced the full council in the spring. Ossix Beta holds formal temporary authority over the pack until the territorial determination is complete. He paused. The Eastern alignment is effectively dissolved. She nodded. The funding mechanism is gone. Whether the intent behind it survives in another form is a different question. One for another season. He looked at her. The immediate question is this archive. She waited. The position of Arbiter of Records has been vacant for 11 months. The function is legal, reviewing documentation for Crown proceedings, certifying provenance, identifying evidentiary gaps before they become procedural failures. I've been without one since my last arbiter retired, and the absence has been visible. His voice was even, deliberate. The position reports to the council directly. It requires no personal relationship with this office or anyone in it to function. It stands on its own authority and its own remuneration. He held her gaze. I'm offering you the appointment on those terms alone. If every other consideration in this room were removed, the role would still need filling. And you're the most qualified person I've encountered in 11 months of looking. She looked at him for a long moment. That's deliberately separated, she said. Yes. You built it that way, intentionally. I did. She turned her pen over in her hands. Still, without the anchor of the table edge. I don't know who I am outside of the work, she said. Outside of the survival that came before it. 14 years of no legal standing, no registration, no door that locked from the inside that I genuinely felt safe behind. That shapes a person in ways I haven't finished accounting for. She set the pen down. I can tell you what I bring to an arbiter's role. I can tell you what I bring to the work done in this room every evening for the past month. What I can't tell you yet is what I bring beyond that, because I haven't found it yet. He didn't reach toward her, and he didn't fill the silence with reassurance. He simply listened, and when she finished, he said, I know, quietly, with nothing attached to it. You've been running the numbers on yourself the way you run them on everything else, looking for the framework before you'll trust the picture. She stared at him. That's accurate. It isn't a criticism. I know it isn't. She pressed both palms to the table. The arbiter position. I'd like to accept it. Good. The rest I need time with. You have it. He said it plainly. She stood, moved around the corner of the table and kissed him. Not cautiously. Not by small degrees. He'd been long enough alone with her own feelings to know there was nothing cautious about them. His hands came up, one settling at her waist and one to the side of her face. And the quality of his touch was the same as everything else about him. Deliberate, careful, entirely present. The bond between them opened the way a room opens, when a window that has been stuck for a long time finally gives, with a completeness that made the previous state difficult to remember. She felt it settle in the space behind her sternum, and remain there when he pulled back, warm and specific. His forehead rested against hers. His breathing was uneven in a way she hadn't heard from him before. Under her palms, pressed flat against his chest, his heartbeat moved at a pace that was not the pace of a composed man. I need time, she said again, her voice low. I know. His thumb traced her cheekbone slowly. I'm not going anywhere. She pulled back far enough to see his face. In the torchlight, his amber eyes were open and warm, without the layer of measured attention he wore in every public room of this building. She thought about who he was in here, past the hour when the rest of the fortress had relinquished the day. 3 months later, the archive had been reorganized, not rebuilt. Aldrich's essential system remained, and she'd understood enough of its logic to work within rather than against it. The active section had been restructured around the function of a working arbiter's role, which required different things than passive storage. Reference volumes within arm's reach. Correspondence from the 9 territories under continued monitoring filed by quarter rather than by name, because the patterns crossed territorial lines and sequence mattered more than origin. The 7th book sat on the uppermost shelf, catalogued formally as exhibit origin material in the Crown's permanent record. She could see its spine from her chair at the table. Marit had returned to her own territory 6 weeks after the final proceedings closed, with 2 horses and considerably more Crown correspondence than she'd arrived with. She wrote reliably. Her most recent letter described a border mediation she was conducting on her lord's behalf, in a tone that suggested she was discovering an aptitude for the work, with a postscript asking whether the archive reorganization was complete or still ongoing. Vera had written back that reorganization was by its nature always ongoing, which was not evasion, but a precise description of archive work correctly understood. She was reviewing quarterly correspondence from the Eastern Territories on a Tuesday afternoon when she heard footsteps on the stairs and felt the warmth move through her chest that arrived ahead of him. She had stopped recording it as an anomaly and begun treating it as information. Kaylin came in without announcement and sat at the far end of the table with a folder and the settled ease of a man occupying a room that had long since stopped requiring any adjustment. He pushed his sleeves to his forearms and opened the folder. She returned to the Eastern correspondence. Outside the windows, the afternoon light lay in long, pale bands across the stone floor, the particular angle of a season tilting toward cold, and the archive was warm and carried the smell of old paper and the quality of air that accumulated in rooms where consistent work was done and kept. The kind of room that held the impression of everything that had taken place in it and gave it back gradually, over time, to anyone who knew how to read what a room remembered. She reached for the next letter in the correspondence stack, broke its seal, and read. His pen moved. Hers moved. The rain that had been threatening since morning finally arrived at the window glass, soft and without urgency, and the fortress settled around them in the unhurried way it had every afternoon for the past 12 weeks. As though 2 people had always been part of its rhythm, and the rhythm had simply waited for them to arrive. Her hands were steady on the page,